Hey there, and welcome to Thousand Ant, where we give you devlogs, Unity tutorials, and game dev advice. I'm Matt Shell, and in this video, I want to talk about the idea of hooks, as put forward by Ryan Clark in his excellent article on the subject. And basically what this means is kind of points of uniqueness or points that are going to hook people in and generate interest in your indie game. Let's get started. All right, so when we're talking about hooks, we're basically talking about what you could call unique selling points. You sometimes hear in the kind of product design landscape. It's basically saying, why is this interesting to somebody? What is it about this that's going to grab them and make them want to know more, make them want to engage, and ultimately, in the case of indie game marketing, make them want to buy your game? And I think that this idea of hooks and picking a hooky design, or at the very least, evaluating your design in light of hooks, is a very important idea for indie game developers who are trying to make something commercial, right? If you're just off in the kind of experimental art game landscape and you're not trying to sell your game for money on Steam, or that's a low priority for you, you know, this is irrelevant. And I'm not trying to say that this is the only way to do it or anything like that. But if you're trying to make a commercial indie game and sell it on Steam or sell it on itch or sell it on the Nintendo eShop, this is important. Why would somebody want to know more? Why would they want to make a buy decision? And the thing that is really interesting, tricky, maybe difficult about this is that this is really a decision that has to be made at the beginning of the process, or at least early in the process, right? And I think that many of us who pay attention to indie game marketing have heard those unfortunate stories about people who kind of just bet the farm on a game idea and then get kind of, 75% of the way into development and say, okay, now it's time to do some marketing. And let's go and tell people about our game. Let's start a Twitter account, or let's make a Steam page and a trailer and try to get some interest. And then they realize that people are not that interested because their idea is not that hooky, because there isn't anything about it for people to say, hey, have you heard about this game? It's got this and it does that and it's different in this way. And I think that, at that point, it's hard to solve that problem, right? And you hear about this. I remember Adam Saltsman kind of mentioned this in his talk that is not specifically about this, but related. It's about making games that can sell, having ideas that are marketable. And he would have people come up to him in exactly that situation and be like, well, we're running out of money, or we're kind of getting into trouble with this indie game project. We bet the farm on it. And what should we do? Should we make some Twitter posts? And it's kind of like, it's bad news. So I think that there's a importance in thinking about marketing as a kind of a holistic thread that starts at the beginning of your project. And I don't know if this is the most important aspect of this, but making something notable, making something that other people will notice and go and talk about or want to be interested in from the beginning, what you make is so important in that regard, right? And whether it's hooky and has points of entry to generate interest is really critical, right? So in the original article, Clark talks about Darkest Dungeon, right? And he says this is a kind of psychologically realistic dungeon crawling game where your dungeoneers, your party members get traumatized by being in the dungeon, right? That is a hook. That's something novel. It's something understandable. It's a little bit in opposition to games like Final Fantasy or pretty much any other RPG game, right? Where people are just relentlessly going through combat, party members are dying, and they're just kind of smiling along, and there's zero psychological impact to anything, basically. And so Darkest Dungeon was kind of against the prevailing idea, quite unique in that regard. And then they had a really unique art style. This is something else that Clark identifies. And, there's a couple other hooks that he mentions, but those were kind of the two main hooks, right? There was this great kind of woodcut art style that worked really well with the mood. And then there was this kind of psychological simulation hook. And I think if we look at some modern games that have done really well, we have something like Hades, which is really succeeding well. What I would identify as the hooks there are the characters and the concept art, right? This world of these really well illustrated characters that are talking to you and having these conversations. I don't know if having something be a roguelike is exactly a hook in this era, but it definitely is a popular genre, and a really well executed action roguelike is definitely commercially viable, right? So they did a really well executed action roguelike with these very visually interesting character art and this idea that you're interacting with these characters. I also think that the idea of Greek mythology was a kind of a hook because it's a kind of an entry point. Many of us grew up knowing who Zeus was and who Athena was and having ideas about them, and then saying, oh, we're seeing Athena, but we're seeing her in a little bit of a different light, or we're seeing Zeus and Zeus is like this. And actually we're looking at things from the underworld, which is a little bit of a twist on that. And so I think that was a kind of a hook as well. It was accessible, something familiar, and then a twist on something familiar, which is a kind of a classic formula for popular appeal, right? You look at Puff Daddy remixing, the Police, and remixing every hit from the 70s to make hip hop songs in the 90s and the 2000s, and just chart after chart after chart hit with that kind of remixing of a hit formula, which I think is a little bit what Hades did there, with Greek mythology being the original hit, and then they kind of remixed it and made a roguelike. I think that getting to the point where you can kind of look at things that are successful and think, okay, what were the hooks here? And why did this stand out? Why did this do well? Is a valuable skill. And then being able to evaluate your own design in these terms and not investing money in things, or not investing time, years of effort into things like a puzzle platformer that doesn't have a really clear hook to it. And honestly, even now, I think a lot of the hooks that people like, I think if Braid came out now, where it's like, it's a puzzle platformer with time manipulation. I mean, that is a good hook, right? But I think now, I don't know if that hook would have hit the way it hit back then. It was much more novel at the time, and we hadn't seen as many puzzle platformers with gimmicky features since then. And, that's an important detail as well, is that it's all contextual, right? It's all about, in this moment, in the landscape of what's going on, is what you're doing unique and notable? Does it offer something that you're not getting from 25 other puzzle platformers with a twist, And is there something that somebody's going to want to write an article about it, right? Darkest Dungeon, you can totally see that. They might say, hey, we've never seen before a game with these psychological consequences. It's notable, it's newsworthy, it's worth talking about. It's something you could tell your friend about and be like, oh, did you see this game where your party members are going crazy and they're attacking each other and they're losing their minds in this dungeon and it's really dark? And then the name is Darkest Dungeon. It all packages together in a really smart way. And I think that having a good idea of what those hooks are allows you to kind of say, okay, as we're making this, are we reinforcing the hooks? Are we undermining it? There was an interesting Twitter thread just the other day, one of the developers of this game, Going Under, which is a kind of a roguelike that is a satirical send-up of startup culture. So it's a kind of an action roguelike set in a failing startup with all the toxic work culture memes in that. And it's rendered, or the art style, the art direction is kind of in this colorful blob people that you see in a lot of modern startup illustrations, right? So it's a very clever and novel, notable idea, right? But he was kind of posting that, hey, we didn't sell, I think they sold okay, but they didn't sell as well as they had hoped. And he was saying he was asking for feedback on Twitter, and there was some interesting feedback that people gave. But what I would argue there was, you're making an action roguelike that the audience for these is really, people have kind of cut their teeth on Spelunky, Binding of Isaac, and games like that. And this colorful startup imagery, art direction, it looks like more like a Keita Takahashi, Katamari Damacy type idea, or like Pikuniku, or some of these more lighthearted, childlike but not for kids kind of games. And I think that the mismatch in the art direction there, while kind of clever, like, oh, it's this startup visual style, maybe the mismatch in the art direction there was a little bit of like a, what is this? Like, it didn't quite communicate, or maybe it was a little too clever, a little too subtle. I actually haven't played the game yet. I kind of want to. It looks cool. I think it would be actually worth, in the name of this kind of research process, looking at it. So maybe I will, and I'll report back. But I think that their public saying, hey, we didn't quite hit the way we wanted to, you know, and then looking at that and thinking, okay, why? Because I don't think it was a badly made game. The art was appealing. There definitely was a hook. There was something kind of interesting, but maybe it was like a little too subtle and clever, or a little too tongue-in-cheek, or maybe the idea of taking that and then doing a roguelike was kind of like roguelike players are expecting dungeons and caves, not necessarily startup basements and colorful artwork, and maybe that was the thing that kind of undermined it. I don't know. But I think kind of getting into this mode of analyzing games in this regard, thinking about it, most importantly, thinking about our own designs in this regard, trying to answer these questions. And if you can't, either try to figure out how to, or maybe this is an idea that you can't really communicate, right? I'm wrestling with this with my Untitled Cute Space game now. I have not fully answered these questions, right? So that's a kind of a red light for me, but I'm thinking about it, and you know, I'll try to share them as I do. Importantly, these are not easy things to come up with. This is not something that you just snap your fingers and get. If everybody had good hooks for everything, then it would be a lot more competitive, right? So the goal is to stand out. It means it's got to be better than, you know, a lot of other people, right? So it's a competitive thing and not easy to do, right? So easier said than done is the category I'd put it in. If you've wrestled with this, or if you've read the article and you've thought about it, let me know down in the comments what your kind of thinking about this is as it applies to your own projects. Do consider subscribing if you're enjoying the content. Turn on notifications if you actually want to be notified when videos come out. Do you think Clark is wrong, right? Is this irrelevant? Krypton the Necrodancer was a huge hit, and his other games seem to be doing well, so I think he speaks with some credibility behind him here, but let me know if you disagree down in the comments. Drop a like on the video if you're enjoying it, and yeah, just thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.